Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about none other than the Blackberry Passport and see how this bad boy holds up in 2021. Now, funny enough, this device is one of those phones that I just think like Blackberry, I don't know, like I love Blackberry a lot, but it's also a very funny thing that they did with this specific device. Now, first of all, if you want to pick it up or any other phones I'd recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can pick it up from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now on the front, you can see we have a little bit of a different setup. We have the screen and we have the keyboard. Now looking at this phone, you may assume that it came out in like 2007 or something, but that is not the case. It came out in 2014, which is about the same year, which is exactly the same year as the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. So we were pretty much beyond that keyboard phase with a lot of our devices, but Blackberry, knowing, the history with Blackberry and those keyboards, they decided to stick with it, just like how they did with the Blackberry Priv, I think it was, or some other devices too. But I like this phone, I think it was pretty interesting. Now you did have that 4.5-inch IPS panel on the top, and believe it or not, it was actually a pretty decent panel. It was 1440p by 1440p, so it was exactly a square. Now I think the panel itself is actually pretty strong. I think it's a pretty good panel, but I do think with it being a square, it made a lot of use cases with it a little kind of strange, because they had to do it because of this, keyboard, so it makes sense. But a lot of the games and stuff I played with it was very, very weird at the time I used it, and I will go into that more than the software section. The keyboard on the bottom though is another really cool thing. Now there really isn't anything like super crazy with this keyboard. I think it did have that feature where you could kind of swipe on it. It was either this keyboard or another keyboard, but I do think, having a keyboard like this is cool, but most people don't need a keyboard all the time, and that's why software keyboards are the best in my opinion. But these physical keyboards, like something like the Blackberry Priv, where you can swipe up and get the keyboard whenever you want to, I think that's way more functional than this type of device. So that's kind of another hardware thing that would, that's kind of funny about this phone. Now on the bottom, you do have the micro USB port, which is great. You also have a micro SD card slot on this phone too, which I think is another cool little asset. Again, having those type of capabilities on this device is kind of cool, and I love having that expandable storage. And on the back, you have a little bit kind of like a removable back. It wasn't like fully removable, but there was a little portion of it. And you had that camera setup as well. Now, feeling the phone in the hand, it doesn't feel like a cheap phone. It feels like a pretty good phone still. It is pretty much built out of plastic. It has the plastic back. The keyboard on the front isn't like the craziest, best feeling keyboard ever. But again, it's tactile and, it gets the job done for sure. So I think in terms of the outside, that really pretty much covers it up. It looks a little bit different than a lot of other phones that we're getting nowadays. But again, Blackberry took a risk, and I can surely appreciate that, especially now in 2021 when a lot of manufacturers are kind of removing things from devices. At least Blackberry was putting things in their devices in a way. Now moving on to the camera, this is probably going to be pretty quick because I think most people probably know how this camera is going to hold up. It had a single 13 megapixel back facing camera, and then it had a 2 megapixel front facing camera. Now with that back camera, you had optical image stabilization, which I think is great, but you also had the ability of shooting 1080p at 60 frames per second. And at that time, that's actually a pretty decent resolution. To give you some perspective, the iPhone 6 that came out at that same time could only do 1080p at 30, I believe. So the fact that this thing could do 1080p at 60 is a huge asset for it for sure. Now, it doesn't have the multiple lenses, it doesn't have anything super crazy like an ultra wide or anything, but as I mentioned before, I think for a day-to-day task for the average person out there, it's probably going to get the job done. I don't think it's going to be that big of an issue for a lot of people, and I mentioned this before and I'll say it again, the biggest differentiating factor from a phone like this and a phone in 2021 is the amount of lenses. Really, like the software and like the features and this and that, it really just comes down to the lenses. That's like the first immediate difference, and then comes down to like the video resolutions. Because this thing only taps out at 1080p at 60, you're already kind of outdated because a lot of phones nowadays can already do 4K at 60, and some of them can even do 8K. So we're definitely moving into a range where this is probably going to be more outdated than not, but I do appreciate at that time that this camera was actually pretty okay. Now with that 2 megapixel front facing camera, 720p videos on that, and I really do think this camera is really not that good, unfortunately. For some reason, a lot of these Android phones, especially at this time, just didn't do so well, and that's something I really didn't like. I feel like Androids really have really good back-facing cameras, sometimes better than a lot of iPhones, but their front-facing cameras just aren't as good and don't last as long in terms of my opinion, comparatively to like the iOS side of things. So I think when it comes down to that, you're probably going to be getting a better front-facing camera from the iPhone of that year, or even the year before, but this whole entire camera setup I think gets the job done for the most part. So in terms of that, that pretty much covers it up in that standpoint. Now, hating on the software and the battery life. Now, these two things are probably two kind of somewhat interesting things about this device, because on one hand, the software really isn't that great anymore, but the battery life is actually pretty good from a device like this. Now, software-wise, it did start off with the Blackberry OS 10.3. I guess it did go up to 10.3.2 according to the specific GSM Arena, website. Now, I will tell you, I think, Blackberry OS had its time. Blackberry did switch over to kind of like more like stockish Android. It didn't really have this big of a skin. At its core, this is an Android device with the Blackberry over it. So to kind of give you some gist to it, it's kind of like, One UI. One UI is kind of like stock Android, but with a bunch of more bloatware on it. Blackberry OS is kind of the same thing too. And with Blackberry OS, some disadvantages you're getting from this type of device are really like, these devices aren't going to last as long in terms of software. You're not going to be getting like the same day updates as stock Android, and it's just not going to last as long. And those are the problems. Now, luckily with this type of device, I was able to install a bunch of APKs and a bunch of different files like that. So you're probably going to be okay when it comes down to that standpoint. But as I mentioned before, having a device that can be on stock Android, even like the original Pixel, is going to be giving you a much better experience in terms of software. On the flip side though, you do have a massive size battery on this device, a 3450 mAh battery. And there are still a lot of devices that come out this day and age that don't even have this size of battery. And we're still, to be honest, we're still hovering around this 3450 kind of, 4000 mAh battery range. We're kind of getting inside, the S20 Ultra with the 5000 mAh battery. We're starting to get a little bit bigger, but we're still kind of in this, position where this battery is still a massive size battery at its core. So on one hand, the software really isn't that good anymore, but the battery life is something that's really, really awesome about this device. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. Now, ending it off with the performance, this device had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 801 chipset, a quad-core CPU, an Adreno 330 GPU, and 3GB of RAM on the only model that this phone came out with. And I think the performance of this phone was, the chipset inside of it, the RAM inside of it, was actually a pretty decent amount of, specifications that this device had, especially when you compare it to the, other Android devices of that year. I think the Galaxy S5 came out the same year as this device, and you pretty much almost had the same specs as that phone as this one. And I think, at that time, this device was probably a good performing phone, but in this day and age, as I mentioned before, it's just not going to give you that great of a performance, and it's mostly because of the software, in my opinion. One of the main things I had problems with, as I mentioned before in this video, was the fact that a lot of these apps that I wanted to use don't really fit too well with the square screen that this thing has. And I think, a lot of apps out there can be, customized and, they will fit into this square landscape, but I really didn't like it. And it just kind of made me feel like the keyboard there, having it there all the time, was just so annoying, to be honest. I do understand its functionality and I do like the keyboard, but that did hinder a little bit of kind of what I was expecting from this device. So again, it's nothing super crazy and it's not necessarily like a performance thing, but that was something that I did note. Now, basically every single thing else on this device is pretty slow. You're going to run into some problems here and there. It's going to be glitchy here and there, but I think for day-to-day tasks, it's probably still okay. It's just extremely slow, and there's probably not that much security on this device either, considering the fact that it's been, outdated for quite a bit of time. So I think in terms of that covers up the performance standpoint. And to kind of sum up the video and say answer the question, should you go and buy a Blackberry Passport in 2021? Well, to be completely honest, I really don't think anybody should be buying and using this phone anymore. Quite possibly the most I would recommend doing is buying it to resell later. A lot of these phones have, been able to keep their value up quite a bit, which is so surprising to me. And with phones like this, you're probably going to be in that same boat as well. Now, I will tell you, as I mentioned before, it may be best if you do go and maybe get like the original Pixel. That type of phone is easily going to be able to last you for an insanely long amount of time. And I've seen time and time again people be able to buy those phones and keep them for so many years, especially if you're willing to keep them, custom ROM'd and stuff. Those type of devices are going to be giving you a much better experience in my way that I've seen it for a much longer time than other Android phones like, a Galaxy that came out that year or whatever the case is. But I do think the Blackberry Passport, for it having, the keyboard of that time, for having all these type of cool little things with it, was actually pretty cool. And I do understand the novelty of it, and I do understand what this device brought. But as I mentioned before, the long-term kind of review of this thing, it really isn't necessarily worth it in 2021. I would highly recommend you to pick up something else like, the Samsung Galaxy, of maybe the Samsung Galaxy S9 or Galaxy S10. But even more so than that, as I mentioned before, I would highly recommend picking up the original Pixel or Pixel 2. Those type of devices are going to be giving you a much better experience experience from what I've seen than this type of device in 2021. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.